Good afternoon to all of you. So we're going to talk about less nutrition. Actually, I would not like to refer to less nutrition because, well, this is absolutely necessary. But I would like to talk about fewer calories, and this is what I'm going to talk about, and there's no conflict of interest. Caloric restriction is an issue which is being more and more frequently dealt with. The first publications were in the 30s, and they were not dealing with obesity. They were wondering, well, about what would be a good caloric intake. Do we eat too much? Do we eat enough? Should we eat less, etc.? And there were quite a few studies, animal studies, very few, practically no human studies. And I would like to show you this study on rhesus monkeys published in Science. They followed 76 rhesus monkeys. One third could eat whatever they want, and the others, well, had a controlled intake. They received 30% less calories, and they were followed over a period of 30 years. So here they are, and let me give you the answer. On the left-hand side, you have those that ate more. The old monkeys, they look sad, and the good-looking ones are the ones that ate less. And well, if you have a look at the impact of nutrition, well, the gray matter. There was more gray matter in those that ate less, and they had less aging diseases, less diabetes, less cancer, less cardiovascular diseases, less aging in general. No impact on overall mortality because, when they're fit, they fight each other and eventually they die. So this was a very interesting review, and they tried to find out whether Einstein, if he had eaten less, might not have gained 5 years in life. If he had decided to go on a diet, he would have gained 2 years of life if he had started at 50. What you have to realize is that caloric restriction may have a physiological impact, which has been measured. People with under caloric restriction have a better physiological health, but it also has an impact on psychological and behavioral outcomes. So caloric restriction improves physiological outcome, but also other outcomes. Well, we are dealing with ill patients, critically ill patients, and we know that, ill people suffer from anorexia. This is a physiological phenomenon. And this was a review on anorexia in case of infection. Well, anorexia means physiological changes, behavioral changes. People eat less, of course, and currently we tend to think that anorexia observed in acute illness is a normal phenomenon, if you want. It does not mean that it is not an issue when it is acute and you have to do something about it, and you must feed patients in that case. But you have to be careful. It is a physiological phenomenon that you may have to accept. What about our patients? Well, we do have a number of recommendations that are, well, rather powerful. More than 10 years ago, we were told that patients had to have a caloric intake of between 25 and 30 kilocalories per kilo, and also we had to take into account or to cover energy expenditure. At the time, it was said that in an acute phase, it was possible to consider an energy intake higher than 35 kilocalories per kilo per day. Well, we've changed our views. Today we are between 25 and 30 kilocalories. And we are between 25 and 30 calories during the stabilization phase, which is rather difficult to define. What about European recommendations or international recommendations, both European and American? Well, what is interesting is the way in which the European guidelines are drafted. They say that, well, it might not be a good idea to exceed 20 to 25, so a kind of distrust, if you want. And in the American recommendations, well, they are recommending between 25 and 30, but they also say that effort should be made to provide between 50 and 65. They're not saying that this goal has to be achieved, but they say, well, it might be a good idea. And, well, 50, 65 means about 15 kilocalories per kilo per day. So we're far from the 25 to 30 of the European recommendation. Well, there have been a number of studies. This one is probably the most famous one. It had to do with 55 patients, and it showed there is a relationship between hypocaloric feeding, which remains to be defined, and complications, longer time of stay, and the duration of mechanical ventilation. There's are other studies. This one was published by Christopher Fazy, and it shows that a caloric deficit is associated with an increased Staphylococcus aureus risk or bacteremia. We also have this study that has not to do with intensive care. We have a huge cohort of over 16,000 patients, and the idea was to feed them better, to correct deficits. For example, aged patients who did not eat enough were encouraged to eat more. And it was realized that when you increase intake, you reduce hospital mortality. This is an intensive care study which is regularly referred to and which establishes a link between hypocaloric intake and over mortality. All these studies show, well, usually they're prospective, but sometimes they're retrospective. Populations are not very well targeted. There's no randomization, so establishing a causal link between the various phenomena observed is something rather difficult. This is a study that was very recently published. And here again, this is a prospective study, and they assessed the impact of caloric and protein intake on the outcome of patients. The prescription was 1,758 calories per day. That was the prescribed intake. The received intake was 1,057 kilocalories, so a much lower intake. 14.5 kilocalories per kilo per day, 75% of what had been prescribed. And what they observe in that study with fairly low intake, which is common in intensive care, well, for those patients that have higher caloric intake, for 1,000 calories more, there is a decrease. There's an improvement in the outcome. This has been observed, but we cannot say whether there is a causal relationship. Now, what about caloric excess? But the definition of caloric excess, as you're going to see, is questionable. This study has to do with caloric intake, and you can see that the average caloric intake, the green curve, is lower than the recommended intake. This is an observational prospective study with 180 medical patients. The reference value, the baseline value, was 25 kilocalories per kilo per day. So they divided the group into 3 patients between 0 and 32% of intake, 33 to 65% of intake as compared to the baseline value, and over 66% of the baseline value. Well, the result they observed is that over 18 kilocalories per kilo and per day is associated with an increased mortality risk, mortality and morbidity risk. And contrary to what could have been expected, it was even more the case for more critically ill patients. So, well, it seemed that the recommended levels or overfeeding was not a good idea, so they tested something else. And this is a study on 240 randomized patients well, there were 2 groups actually. And a permissive underfeeding group, patients were underfed. They received 60 to 70% of the theoretical caloric objectives, and the other group was given between 90 and 100% of the caloric objectives. In the permissive group, the intake, the theoretical intake was 1,800, and actually they received 1,000 calories, more or less. And the optimal group, well, in the optimal group, they could not reach their objective because the theoretical level was 1,700, but eventually they received a little over 1,000. So there's not such a discrepancy between the 2 groups. So we have a negative study for the major criteria, mortality at 28 days. But it was positive for a secondary criterion, hospital mortality, so there may be an impact. Now, there are indirect results, indirect outcomes that have to do with the efforts we can make to improve feeding, the administration of feeding, on the basis of protocols. This is a study conducted in Switzerland. There were 3 consecutive periods, 572 patients spending more than 3 days in intensive care. And there were 3 periods. First period, no protocol, no dietitian. Second period, a protocol, and third period, protocol plus dietitian. What was observed is more enteral feeding, more parenteral feeding, and a reduction in the energy deficit. But it had no impact on mortality, which, strangely enough, increased in period C. This study was published in 2008. It is a cluster study comparing protocol in some wards and no protocol in other wards. When there was a protocol, of course, feeding was better administered, but it had no impact on patients' outcome, which was the major objective of the study. This is another study. The implementation of the PEPAP protocol. It shows that if you implement the protocol, you can increase the amount of protein given to patients. And, well, there are other issues actually having to do with the methodology, but it may explain why it has no impact on the outcome of patients. Anyway, improving nutrition has no impact on the outcome. These are the results of the REIGNIER study. For those that know about it, it has to do with the gastric residual volume. And one of the impacts was that patients who received more nutrition, those patients where the residual gastric volume was measured received less food than the other patients. In that particular study, there was no visible impact on mortality in particular. Well, of course, you know about this study, the EPANIC study published in 2011. The objective was to measure the interest of parenteral nutrition, early parenteral nutrition, additional nutrition, versus late parenteral nutrition. And you can see there's a major difference in terms of intake between the two groups, but you can see that, well, it has been criticized. This study has been criticized because the parenteral group had a calorie intake that sometimes exceeded 30 kilos per kilo per day. 30 kilocalories, per kilo per day. And, well, there was an unexpected outcome in that study. The early additional parenteral nutrition group stayed less in hospital. But you have to see that the caloric level was extremely high in the early parenteral nutrition group. What is interesting is the fact that there was a post hoc analysis that showed that the probability of early discharge from intensive care had to do with the level of calories that were administered on day 3, on day 5, and on day 7. I'm sure you're all aware of the Swiss study that was published at the same time, more or less, with a very different methodology, fewer patients that were better selected, and the objective was 25 kilocalories per kilo per day. After randomization, there was parenteral nutrition after day 3, and there was a direct calorimetry. No impact on mortality, but a strong decrease of nosocomial infection risks for patients who had a parenteral nutrition early. But this has been adjusted through indirect calorimetry. Now there's another study, the TICACO study, 2 groups of patients. One group with 25 kilocalories per kilo per day, and in the other group, calories are given on the basis of indirect calorimetrics. This induces an increase of calorie intake, about 2,000, as you can see. The other group was given 1,500 calories per day. Well, the outcome, the results, is there is a tendency to a reduction in hospital mortality. Now, the group that was fed more calories had stayed longer in intensive care and longer in hospital, and an increased nosocomial risk. So this is rather unexpected results. Now there is another study by Doll, a randomized control trial where you randomize parenteral nutrition in critically ill patients with short-term relative contraindications to early enteral nutrition. Either they're given nothing or a standard treatment, or they are administered parenteral feeding. In that study, we had many patients with diabetes